In this video, we are going to take a look at some UV settings that will help you optimize your UVs and get better UV shell layouts. Let's start with the layout settings. By default, when you have a mesh like this and you have the UV shells here, you can select all of them and hit layout, and this is what you get. So what the default layout settings does is that it approximates the Texel density of all these UV shells. It makes sure that they're all relatively the same size. So if you look at the checkerboard, you can see that the squares all across are the same size, and it also lays them out within the 0 to 1 space. One problem that occurs a lot in the default UV layout settings is that sometimes you have these UV shells that are kind of between tiles. And you have this here, you have this part here as well that's within this tile, but it's still sticking out a bit. And as you know, Substance Painter does not like this, and if you do take this model into Substance Painter, you will get an error and won't be able to texture your file. You can fix this by just scaling these UVs down a bit, but an easier way to do this is to change your layout settings to get a better layout. In this one, you can also see that these UV shells are really close to each other, and at lower texture resolutions, the texture from this might bleed into this UV shell and cause artifacts. So let's modify these settings. We can do this by going to Modify and Layout, and here you have this option. Make sure that you're using Unfold 3D, and now let's look at what settings we need to change. So the first thing I'm going to change is the shell padding and the tile padding. Let's start with the tile padding. So what the tile padding does is that it makes sure that there is some space between your UV shell and the outside of the tile. It's set to 0 by default, which is why we have shells that are so close to the edge of the tile. I usually change this to like 4 or 5. So let's see. And you can see that it is pixels. So I'm going to change this to 4 pixels. And let's see what we get. I'm going to hit apply. And what that is going to do is that is going to change how these UVs are laid out and bring them further away from the tile. The UVs are now 4 pixels away from the edge of the tile. And the shell padding just makes sure that these UV shells are also slightly apart from each other. You can set this to a value like 3 or 4. And if I set that here, hit apply, you can see that there is some distance between these UV shells and you won't have textures bleeding into each other. You can also reduce this. As long as there is some distance between the shells, you should not have too much texture bleeding. You just have to test it out and see what works best. Now let's take a look at a setting that we can change if we know what texel density we want these shells to be. When you're doing the layout, as you see, let me change the size of these shells. When you use these settings and hit apply, it's going to change the scaling of these UV shells to fit into that first tile. But sometimes when you are doing the layout, you have already set your shells to the size that you want. You can do this by going into, so you can scale the shells by hand, or if you already know what texel density you want them to be, you can go to your transform options. This might be shut by default, but if you open that out, you can go to transform and texel density. Let's say this shell is the correct texel density. You can hit get, and then you can go to another shell and hit set, or you could select all the shells and hit set, and that's going to give every single UV shell the same texel density as this one. Now let's say these two are a certain texel density that is different from the other UV shells in the section, and you don't want that to change. what you need to do is you need to change the scaling settings of your layout. So I'm going to select all of these and go back to my layout settings. Here you have shell pre-scaling, and at the bottom you have this setting called scale mode. What you want to do if you want to maintain different texel densities across different shells is to change these shell pre-scaling and the scale mode. So I'm going to change shell pre-scaling to off, and I'm going to change the scale mode also to off. Now, when I hit apply, you will see that it does not change the size of these UV shells. An issue that sometimes arises with this, as you can see, is that it won't pack the UV shells completely within that first UV tile. This is usually okay because then you can make your decisions. You can decide whether you would want all of these UV shells to be within the same tile, or whether you would want to use UDIMs and place some of these in a different UV tile. Here is the final layout with a texel density that I chose and with using the layout settings. And now I can also fit additional UV shells within the space. Let me select these again, hit apply. I can now fit additional UV shells within the space that's left in the corners. Another setting that I really like is the transform setting, where you can move UV shells just using these arrows. And I use this for UDIMs generally. So what I do here is I make sure that my transform options are open. And over here in the move settings, I set this to 1 instead of 0.1. And that way, if I select all of these shells or even some of these shells, it's going to keep them in the exact same location, but shift them into another UV tile. And this is super useful for UDIMs. As you can see, I can just select all of these and put them in another UV tile. And you can use these arrows to move them to a different location. An orientation settings that I like is the orient to edges setting, because sometimes when you use the orient shells option, you don't get the exact result that you want. You can see that this still is not rotated either horizontally or vertically. So I can then select one of these edges and orient to edges. That will orient it towards the edge that you have selected. And depending on which direction that edge is facing, it's going to reorient that shell. So I like this to make sure that the shells that I have are completely horizontal or completely vertical. The orient shells option or the orient to edges option, they both take the shell in the direction that it is closest to. So if this is closest to the vertical direction and I use orient to edges, that's going to make this vertical across that edge.